Star Wars Echoes, Hunter and Prey. I collapsed against an ancient tree, bile catching in my throat. I swallowed hard, my chest heaving, and listened for signs of pursuit. I'd spent 15 years as a member of the Bounty Hunters Guild. I'd tracked hardened criminals through the bowels of Hutt space, pinned down Mandalorian mercenaries in the Outer Rim, and collected payouts from some of the highest-ranking Imperial moffs. Now, I was only prey. Manaru warned me this would happen. She'd never approved of my chosen profession. But opportunities were slim in a galaxy that was constantly at war. The old wounds of the Clone Wars, never given the time to heal before being thrust into a second, deadlier conflict. What else was I supposed to do? The Falcon 38 rifle, clutched tight in my trembling hands, was caked in grime, clinging to its last power cell. The rain on this nameless rock didn't wash away the dirt. It turned it into a thick, festering soup that burned like acid against the flesh. I'd had to abandon my armor at the crash site. It was far too heavy for this terrain and would only slow me down. I'd had just enough time to grab the rifle before the ship disappeared into the swamp. I closed my eyes. How long had I been here? 3 days? 4? It was difficult to keep track when the fog filtered out almost all sunlight. I had to get off this planet, and I had to do it soon. I tensed and readied myself for another sprint. Now! How did the beast keep coming? I was no stranger to alien creatures. I'd encountered hundreds during my travels, each as unlikely as the next, but the Wookiee was something else. It had already tracked me across 3 systems and succeeded in blasting my ship from orbit. It had been weeks since I'd slept in a proper bed, and longer still since I'd seen my wife. Once the Wookiee caught your scent, there was no escape. The second he began hunting you, you had only 2 options: run or die. It was all Greedo's fault. It had been 12 months since Han Solo was gunned down in the Mos Eisley Cantina, about the same time as the destruction of Alderaan. Since then, Solo's former co-pilot had made it his mission to exterminate all those who hunted for profit. He'd killed Greedo that very same day, cornered him in an alley behind the cantina before separating his slimy green head from his shoulders. But he hadn't stopped there. I'll admit, I hadn't taken him seriously at first. Greedo was ambitious, but a bottom feeder compared to the rest of us. It was any wonder he'd managed to corner Solo in the first place. But when I heard what happened to Bosk, to Zuckuss, to Forlom, and the others, I nearly hung up my blaster for good. I wished now that I had. I dropped behind the roots of a massive, gnarled tree, my lungs burning again as I pressed my back against the bark. I looked down, a wave of revulsion washing over me, as translucent, multi-legged insects began clawing across my arms. The weeping sores and infected tissue, caused by too much exposure to acid rain, irresistible to the planet's native fauna. I bit my lip to keep from screaming and scraped the swarm away. My arms bled anew, leaving crimson streaks across the flesh. I had to come up with a plan. I looked down again at the Falcon 38. 1 shot left, maybe 2. I couldn't outrun the beast. I couldn't outshoot him. There were no spaceports on this rock, and my ship was beyond repair, buried in the bog. Which meant there was only one vessel on this entire cursed world capable of transporting me to safety: the Millennium Falcon. The beast's ship wasn't all that hard to find. The Wookiee wasn't trying to be subtle. He wanted to be noticed. The Falcon had come a long way from an unassuming smuggler's vessel. The beast had transformed it into a dark monolith of blackened durasteel, a flying mausoleum housing his trophies. It was built to intimidate. When a hunter saw that ship, they knew their end was coming. I kept low, my chest rising and falling in shallow, agonizing hitches as I peered through the tangled roots. I didn't move. I didn't even dare to breathe. I hadn't survived 15 years in the guild by assuming my mark was stupid. The Wookiee was a master mechanic and a veteran soldier. He'd spent decades outsmarting the Empire alongside Solo. He knew my ship was scrap. He knew the rain was eating me alive. And he knew this ship was my only ticket off this rock, which meant every foot of mud between me and that boarding ramp was a slaughter box. I adjusted my grip on the rifle, my palms slick with a mixture of mud, blood, and rain. The perimeter appeared silent, but I knew better than to trust appearances. It'd be rigged with thermal detonators, pressure plate mines buried in the rotting moss, or motion sensors tuned to pick up even the slightest movement. The ship wasn't just a transport. It was the ultimate trap, and he was waiting for me to step right into the jaws. I crept forward, inching through the mud. 5 yards in, I caught the faint, unnaturally straight glint of a microfilament string taut between two roots, a rig tied directly to a cluster of Class A thermal detonators. I held my breath, lifting my boot high, and stepped cleanly over it. So far, so good. The veteran hunter in me was still alive, fighting through the fever and the rot. 50 feet from the boarding ramp, the ship towered over me, a massive carcass of scorched metal casting a long, dark shadow in the haze. I squeezed the Vulcan 38 against my ribs, watching for the subtle shimmer of proximity sensors. 40 feet. A patch of pale moss looked too pristine, slightly elevated above the surrounding mire. A pressure plate. I angled my hips, shifting my weight carefully, and bypassed it without incident. 30 feet. Click, shh. I froze. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged animal. Was that metal grinding? A sensor cycling? No, it's your imagination, just the swamp settling. Keep moving. 20 feet. The open belly of the ramp was right there, a dark doorway to freedom. 10. Wham! It came from the side with the full, bone-shattering force of a runaway dewback. The impact blew the air from my lungs in an explosion of red, sending my rifle flying into the fog. My shoulder caved in with a sickening crunch, and the world spun violently as I slammed into the mud, head bouncing off a buried root. Vision swimming, spit and blood filling my mouth, I looked up through the rain. Out of the mist, towering over me like a demon born of hair and shadow, stood the Wookiee. He was leaner than the stories claimed, stripped of the smuggler's weight and transformed into a mountain of wire and muscle. His fur was a wild, mangy nightmare, matted with old blood and the grime of the swamp. Hanging across his chest alongside his bandolier were dark souvenirs. Bosk's yellow flight suit insignia, a cracked piece of Forlom's chassis, and a string of Mandalorian armor plates. I barely raised my bad arm before he closed the distance. A massive, furred fist collided with my jaw, sending a metallic spray of blood into the air. Before I hit the ground, he caught me by the collar of my torn flight suit and hoisted me like a sack of meat. He slammed me spine first against the hull of the Falcon, the iron-tasting air detonating from my lungs in a strangled gasp. He raised a colossal hand to crush my skull. Think, Dengar, think. My hand flailed blindly, catching the thick leather of the bandolier draped across his chest. Among his sick trophies, my fingers closed around the jagged, shattered edge of Forlom's droid chassis. A piece of razor-sharp durasteel he wore like a medal. With every ounce of strength left in my dying body, I yanked the jagged metal free and gouged it straight upward into the Wookiee's eyes. The metal bit deep. A guttural, agonizing roar tore from his throat as black blood spattered across my face. He recoiled violently, his massive hands flying to his face as he reeled backward down the ramp. The grip on my collar vanished. I collapsed onto the slick, bloodied steel of the boarding ramp, choking on air, and dragged myself upward into the dark belly of the ship. A terrifying roar shook the hull. He was already clearing the blood from his eyes. I could hear his massive feet pounding back toward the ramp, fast, relentless, like an incoming storm. Where's the override? Where's the damn switch? I shoved myself against the wall, my slick fingers clawing at the bulkhead near the doorway. In standard Corellian freighters, the manual ramp release was housed in a recessed access panel to the right of the airlock. My bloody palms slammed into the latch, ripping the casing free, and I grabbed the emergency hydraulic lever inside. I threw my entire weight downward. The hydraulic system screeched in protest. The Wookiee had clearly modified the ship's mechanisms to run heavier and louder before the ramp groaned and began to rise. "Come on, you piece of junk!" I screamed, spitting blood. The Wookiee burst through the fog, a fury of matted fur and blood, his eyes locked onto mine. He leapt. A massive, clawed hand shot through the remaining foot of open space, snatching at my boots. His fingers grazed the worn leather of my heel, pulling with enough force to nearly yank me back out into the swamp. I kicked wildly with my free leg, driving my heavy soul straight into his mangled nose. He roared, his grip slipping, and a deafening clang echoed through the corridor as the heavy steel ramp slammed shut and sealed tight. I didn't pause. I scrambled down the narrow passageway, bouncing off the curved bulkheads as my vision blurred. I threw myself into the cockpit, falling heavy into the pilot's seat, Han Solo's seat, and stared at a console that looked like a nightmare. The Corellian layout was familiar, but the Wookiee had stripped away the stock housing, exposing a tangle of raw wires, spliced switches, and brutalist modifications. A red lockdown light pulsed on the console. Security lock. "No, no, no!" I screamed, hands shaking wildly as I ripped open the maintenance panel under the yoke. I grabbed a pair of exposed wires, ignoring the hot spark that bit into my thumb, and shoved them directly into the primary ignition relay. The console flared to life. The sublight turbines groaned, a low mechanical thrum vibrating straight through the deck plates and into my broken spine. Bang! A heavy metallic thud rattled the entire ship. He was on the hull. Bang! Bang! The cockpit shivered. Through the viewport, I couldn't see him, but I could hear him. A muffled, terrifying roar of absolute, unbridled rage echoing through the swamp. He was beating his way through the outer plating with his bare hands. "Hurry up!" I slammed my palm against the sublight throttles, begging the preheaters to catch. The engine indicators flickered from amber to green. I shoved the controls forward. The Falcon lurched violently, screaming as the engines took hold. The swamp dropped away in a blur of gray fog and twisted trees, the heavy gravitational pull pinning me deep into the cracked leather of Solo's chair. The sky dissolved from sour green mud to thin clouds to the absolute cold black of open space. The starlight hit the viewport, sharp and silent. The pounding stopped. The silence of the void swallowed the swamp whole. I leaned back into the headrest, my chest heaving, tears of blood and sweat stinging my eyes. A hysterical, breathless laugh bubbled up from my throat, cracking through my lips. I'd done it. I'd beaten the beast. I'd escaped. I closed my eyes, letting the sweet relief wash over me. A low, wet growl sounded behind me.